Well, the Global Institute for Food Security at the University of Saskatchewan has redirected its equipment from studying food to running COVID-19 tests. Now, ironically, the COVID-19 pandemic may be putting stress on food security in Canada. In 1967, Alex Robertson ended his then 22-year career with the Hudson's Bay Trading Company to set up this, what is standing behind me, which is the famous Robertson's Trading. It is still an active trading post that deals in furs and other animal products. It's really more of a mix of a grocery store, museum, and active fur trading post. Now, why it is situated behind me is because today's video is all about hunting and fishing and trapping rights in Saskatchewan and climate change. During the height of COVID, around May 4th to 10th, the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada put out an online survey to gauge citizens' feelings and perceptions on food insecurity in their homes. Now, what they found was that about 15%, or 1 in 7, had faced food insecurity in their home in the last month. When we compare this to the 2017 to 18 Community Health Survey, we find that this is about 40% higher. So what this says to researchers, readers, and the average Canadian is that COVID is putting stress on our supply chains and on our grocery shopping and on our wallets. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Settee, Priscilla. Great to have you with us, with NBC, with the North. I understand you have long been understood to be a Cree activist for First Nations rights, women's rights, environmental rights. You've worked with Aboriginal gang members. You fought for the creation of a women's shelter in the Prince Albert area. You've authored many publications, just briefly, including Strength of Women, Akamimumwak, I hope I didn't brutalize that pronunciation, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in 2011, which was through the Health Promotion and Disease Prevention Directorate. Sounds very appropriate now. Pamatsuin, Global Indigenous Knowledge Systems in 2013, and most recently a textbook that we will talk about on global indigenous, on food security that just came out this year. You're currently a professor with the Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Saskatchewan, and your specialty is Aboriginal ways of understanding the worlds of sciences and engineering. So quite a big personal CV. Is all of that correct? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, that's all correct. Well, when you get this old, you have a lot behind you. So yeah, that's pretty much correct. Yeah.
Some really, really big news. As of August in last year, 2019, you were named the recipient of a David Suzuki Fellowship to investigate impacts of climate change on hunting and trapping in Saskatchewan's north. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. And if you want some background to that, I was doing a food sovereignty security study for the Federation of Sovereign Nations, Indigenous Sovereign Nations. And I did that in L'Orange at the annual General Assembly of the Northern Saskatchewan Trappers Association. And I was so struck by, I guess, conditions that had them very concerned, and the impact that it had on, of course, food systems and just way of life and the integrity of the community in terms of the feelings of the trappers. So I was really moved by that because it was clear that the trappers were really lamenting a possible loss of way of life, one that provided dignity and cultural continuity and, all the things that make us who we are. So I wanted to go deeper into that study, which turned out to be about an 80-page document for the Federation. And I wanted to go deeper into that and go back and talk to more of the trappers. So I applied for a Suzuki fellowship and I got it. And they were really glad to support my application, in part because they don't have a presence here in the province. They do have a presence in almost every province in Canada, but not here. So it worked out for their needs and of course they were excited about the research.
This is a critical moment in history, and we need bold ideas now more than ever. That's why we're investing in scholars to develop ideas that are creative, that are bright and effective.
I'm working with Northern Saskatchewan trappers to talk about and listen, more importantly, about the devastation of their natural environment and to discuss solutions to the problem. So I became a Suzuki Fellow in the fall of last year, and I went to several communities, including Lac La Ronge Band and my own Cumberland House First Nations, and I did a number of interviews. So then, of course, I was planning to go in and do more interviews, but COVID interrupted. So I'm figuring out what to do with what I have, which is quite a bit, because when I went into Cumberland House, I took the Aboriginal People's Television Network people with me. So in addition to doing all the filming of all my interviews, they were able to put together several stories from the fall. And so, we have a lot of footage. And so now it's a matter of pulling some of that footage together. And I've started writing up my research. So yeah, I hope to be completed by late summer of this year. My original plan was to do a documentary, but because I couldn't get into there was no annual general meeting of the trappers this year because it was canceled because of COVID, and I was going to go there and do some film work there, but it was canceled, so I didn't do that. So I'm going to have to figure out how much of the existing footage would be appropriate for some type of documentary to, really broadcast the situation for Northern trappers.
Thank you. And I had to bring this up. Obviously, there's a lot of clout that goes with somebody's name as significant as Mr. David Suzuki, but this is really just recognition of work that you've been doing since the early 2000s. 20 years you've been looking at biodiversity knowledge and where it intersects with economy and indigenous rights. So congratulations on your fellowship, but I think it really is just a feather in your hat to the good work that you've been doing for decades. In regards of your research, how is that going? Have you found more or less impact on our province's trappers than you expected?
Yes, I spent a weekend with the Carrier family clan, who really gave me an in-depth look at the history of my own community, as I had not understood it in such depth, because I interviewed 5 of the Carrier brothers, and who are very highly recognized as cultural keepers, people who've grown up on the land for many generations. So when I went in there in the night, like it was dark, and so I didn't notice the environment, but leaving, and after hearing the stories, and I just saw, as I was leaving the village, all of the trees along the side of the road were dead. And that was really something that if it had been light when I went into the community, I would have seen all that. But just the stories that I recorded and heard and conversations I had with the people, it really reinforced what I had heard. And those dead trees are a direct result of the fluctuating dam conditions of the E.B. Campbell Dam down south.
Well, on July 14th of this year, it was reported that water flows into the Churchill River systems, North Saskatchewan river systems, and most water systems in the province were higher than normal and, quote, concerning to the province. Now, as a result, they said that they would be increasing the flow to the E.B. Campbell Dam in the south of the province.
And I heard many rich stories about, how that all happened, and over the decade or so, how it's greatly impacted the community. With almost no compensation back to the community. Meanwhile, raking like millions of dollars in profits for the provincial government and the people of Saskatchewan.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Is there, I look forward to obviously reading more about that issue in your forthcoming publication. Is there anything else, any other stories or anecdotes you can share without giving away that great research that's forthcoming, but specific instances in Saskatchewan where our people were, their ubiquitous rights to hunt and fish may have been impinged by industry or otherwise?
Yes. Well, and in fact, we are at a monumental crisis. It's not an exaggeration to say what we are facing in this province is monumental in terms of the impact of environmental degradation in our communities. And I'm talking now about another community that I'm working with, Magwasagayigan, and they approach the Forest Protectors Group, which is a loosely organized coalition of people who have cottages up the northwest side of the province. And there are now clearing rights to take every last tree out of that region. And so I went to visit the band. I met with the chief, the traditional chief, and the band council chief, and the councillors. And I said, in part, I'm here as a Suzuki Fellow, as a professor, and as a member of this forest coalition to see what we can do. And so we heard the story that from the traditional chief that there's a plan to put the workings of the oil industry through that community without the consultation of that tiny community. And so it's very concerning that they feel, in addition to having their environment ruined, that they would not get jobs from that, economic benefits from it. So that was really concerning, such a tiny community. And what the traditional chief said is that where the infrastructure will go will pass right through his freshwater supply. He lives apart from the community. And, it was clear he was despondent about it. So that's just one community. And I'm currently reading the inquiry that went in to the Primrose bombing range to see what happened when the Primrose bombing range was developed, where it unilaterally took a huge swath of land away from trappers. And, a lot of the trappers that the inquiry interviewed at that time are now gone, like Leon Iron, Joe OPTQ, and others, men and women. And, it's really chilling to read what they told us back then in the 70s. No, it was the 90s. That inquiry was in 1991. And now these elders are gone and their stories remain because they were interviewed by various lawyers, in part for compensation and et cetera. And, to read the testimonies of these folks, it's clear that they really got shafted, that they've never been compensated adequately, and it really impacted their quality of life very deeply. So it's like a repeat of history, what's happening now.
Has this COVID pandemic affected or delayed your research? I know that you said you
you're now into the writing phase. So maybe it's not as disruptive as it could have been.
Right. Well, I had intended to go further, make more field visits, but I've been prevented from doing that. But it gives me time to read some of the, really good research and books and things to better locate my research within, what I heard from the trappers. So no, it hasn't really limited me because I can continue to do a certain level of it. I was hoping to attend the annual meeting of the Trappers Association, so that would have been a really opportune time to, speak to more trappers. But I know quite a few trappers myself. My family, they were trappers. My parents no longer live, but so I have that really rich background to draw on. So the COVID virus is something that is really concerning, and it's concerning because it really reflects the type of treatment that Northerners have historically received. Inadequate protection, inadequate consultation, with huge impacts. So, for example, we've heard from Buckley Boulanger that the premier of our province didn't even consult with him on the COVID issues. And I also heard Georgina Jolibois on CBC talk about her concerns about, opening up the province in such a really blatant regard, way that does not consider Northerners. And now with the pandemic really escalating in the north, it's really time to pay close attention to the impact of this terrible virus, because as you are aware, people with compromised health are the first to suffer and pass away. And so that certainly is what exists in our community with, inadequate levels of hospitalization and healthcare systems.
If our elders or as acting as knowledge keepers in most of the Indigenous cultures, if they're most threatened by this disease, and God forbid if our vital elders are, as a demographic, part of that is removed, they're being taken out of cultures where orality is a major knowledge transition tool. And a lot of the knowledge around hunting, trapping, that traditional ecological knowledge is locked up inside of them. So the risk that's posed by this pandemic, I know healthy people, young healthy people might say, oh, whatever, we're not at risk. Well, there are different pockets of risk, like the immune compromised, like myself, like the elders that you're drawing on for these kind of studies. And in these different cultures, those are the ones that are most vulnerable to this new pandemic.
Right. In fact, the two people who passed this week were elders from Laloche, and I can't recall the other community. So, and they were in their 80s.
I hesitate to even say this. We'll see if this sticks into the final version of the video, but it does harken back in history to it's almost a clearing of our plains, of our elders. Those are the ones that would get removed by this pandemic and disease. And those are the ones that we in these cultures turn to for not only knowledge, but moral guidance. So it is especially problematic in Northern Saskatchewan for sure. Can we talk a little bit about climate change, which is the David Suzuki grant is based around, and COVID, how the two come together and how disease vectors actually grow and expand with climate change. I know coronaviruses in particular can affect many types of birds and bats, wild cats,
pangolins, different types of animals. But if you look at mosquitoes, say, an organism that many Northerners are unfortunately very familiar with, they transmit malaria and other infectious diseases. And if you look at their ranges over time, climate change is allowing them to grow. It's allowing them more access to more people. So it is kind of not interesting, but unfortunate that I do think these two things are combined. And I'm wondering if you feel that way as well. Do you think people, when they think of diseases and pandemics, need to think of those as consequences of climate change?
Absolutely. I think that, the state, Canada, has been very negligent, as have most states been negligent in really addressing climate change. And for example, like our industrial food system is there's a clear link between climate change and industrial food. There's a clear link between energy, what we use to warm our homes and what we use to drive our cars, and just energy that fuels our social systems, our economic systems. And it's proven that, there's a direct link to that and climate change with, the weather conditions and the impact of storms and droughts. And we really, one of the things that the study on food sovereignty allows me to do is to look at conditions all over the world. And, scientists and people who live on the ground are really predicting that, the food system is going to be hugely impacted. And we'll see that as soon as this year with the COVID virus having an impact on how food is produced, by whom, and the price of food. Right now, there's already been warning signals that a lot of the food industry workers who come in from other parts of the world have limitations. Some of them have been reported to have COVID, and then some of the industrial meat packer places have also had incidents of workers with COVID. So to me, that scares the hell out of me. I try to support personally, small farmers in the purchase of some of our groceries, and I try and steer away from industrial food sources, but a lot of people can't. A lot of people don't have the knowledge about some of the dangers that are involved in the global food, production system.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue to our next topic, which is addressing that new textbook that you've put out, I believe in January of this year, early this year, and you you were an editor along with Mr. And I hope I don't screw up his name here, Sailesh Shukla, Indigenous Studies at University of Winnipeg. Yeah. So This is a great new text that's come out, Indigenous Food Systems, Concepts, Cases, and Conversations. I just this afternoon purchased my version online, but it is available via the Red Tide bookstore in Saskatoon, or you can reach out to Dr. Settee to get a copy, or get it like I did online. This is crucial reading if you're interested in food security, if you're interested in Indigenous food sovereignty, if you're really interested in a pan-Canada sustainable food system, pick up this textbook. And I read a bit of it this afternoon. Very insightful, very amazing stuff. Is there anything that you want to talk about, introduce this new text, or anything that you want to draw on from it?
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, we need to give people hope about that there are solutions, and that many communities are based on a very rich history and cultural baggage of food production. So what this book does, in addition to talking about things like climate change and its impact on food systems, is it also documents the stories of regeneration of food systems within First Nations and Métis communities. So, we all this bad news, we really need to counter it with good news, and that really a lot of times the solutions are in our backyard and within our capacity. So I've seen in the years that I've been teaching about food sovereignty, I really noticed a growth in awareness and interest in food production by ordinary means. And this is very exciting. And so the book reflects that, of communities that had concerns around, high rates of diabetes and other preventable diseases, and they did something about it. And so people were really happy to write about their communities and talk about how they were able to not only retain or sustain, but to redesign food productions. Because I think we need to, as First Nations people, consider that, maybe a lot of the old plants are no longer available, or maybe we need to adapt our diets through, new methods and means that can be a healthy alternative. So not to say not consider the old foods, but to consider that we need to adapt our diets at this time.
I think, I will echo what you said, that there's a nice balance there between, some of these heavy topics of food emancipation. Ooh, it's heavy, but then you're right. We need to strike a balance between the heaviness of that and the lightness and the positivity of some of the great things that communities are doing. Just right off the top, in my reading, I was able to see that you've included Northern Manitoba, the Alexander First Nation, Treaty 6 Alberta, the Sartlip in BC Garden Project, and some stuff on the inner city of Saskatoon as case samples. So there is a really good kind of pan-Canadian kind of prairie coverage there about different places and what they've done for their food sovereignty initiatives. Really, really great stuff indeed. It also has a lot of additional reading for people that are interested in this topic like myself. So anybody in nutrition or epidemiology, food, medicine, you're going to want to pick this up. In my own research about food security, I encountered the opinion from some First Nations people more so around gathering of medicines, but let's say rat root, that these things needed to be came upon naturally while out on the land in kind of a nomadic style. The inverse of this saying, like cultivation or something like that, is decidedly more settler, I guess, in comparison. So what would you say to people that say that gardening is not Indigenous?
Goes along with the notion that culture is always changing. And, that's fine. I mean, some things can stay strong, but culture is always changing. Mm-hmm. And we need to recognize that. Well, I would say we need to deal with the crises of health in particularly the north and remote communities. And, at one time, Saskatchewan, as a farming nation, produced, 70 to 80% of its fruits and vegetables. Now we import that, if not more, only because we've really gotten out of production of food. And, Northerners still access some of those cultivated foods in places like through the northern stores and co-ops. And so it's not that they aren't already eating these foods. It's that, that's already being done. So these foods can be produced locally. And Manitoba has been a great example of food production throughout the north. This is a province that's been greatly impacted by dams, like major impact, that had major impact on food sources. But today they represent communities probably 50 communities minimally that are working with academics and others to redevelop food systems. And the book covers one or two of those cases, but there's many more stories that are being realized that haven't been told, and are a good example of how we could adapt. So one of the things that I'm suggesting now is for people to consider that, the environment has, we're not going to recover the environment overnight, and we really need to deal with the needs immediately. So I've been happy to work with some communities where people are building greenhouses and doing market gardens here in the province and in First Nations. And, these are examples that can be replicated. And I'm very happy that since the study we did with the Federation of Sovereign Nations, that they are starting on a really focused grow your own food movement this spring. So, that came out of the findings that we did for our study and the realization that we have a crisis here. The people from the field have told us that there's problems with some of the traditional country foods. We must adapt our diets, and by any means necessary. So that's the plan that more and more communities are undertaking, and we need to spread that knowledge so that even more communities will, pick up the movement.
Some of our NBC listeners have live in the very far north, the Athabasca, which I know food security is always an ongoing topic, and they have expressed concern about the exorbitant prices. Now, I know price gouging is illegal in the pandemic. They nevertheless are still worried about this. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about these far north isolated fly-in communities, and if your textbook and food sovereignty represents an opportunity to them. Also about the federal government's food box system and whether or not you think that works or if it's broke. I know in the past it's changed a lot under Harper, and it used to give things like maybe bullets or skidoo parts if people wanted to live in a subsistence culture, but they've really pulled that back. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that federal mechanism to help out our far north and whether or not it works.
Well, first of all, that northern aid around food was flawed from the beginning, and it continues to be flawed in that it doesn't pass the savings on to people.
Individuals, yeah.
It passes on not savings, but the benefits to the corporations, which are, Hudson Bay and others. So that has to be rectified. And we have met, I belong to a couple of organizations nationally and internationally around food sovereignty. And we've had multiple meetings with the Minister of Agriculture. We've written many briefs. We've explained it in clear language, what we believe needs to be done, and still they don't listen. So, this is the politics of large-scale agriculture, that it's the most lucrative, or the agencies that are gaining the most are the ones that continue to gain. And so the price of food remains high. The quality of the food is poor. So we need to fix that. And again, we point to certain regions of Canada where people have done that. And I think Manitoba is a province that has really put, hundreds of projects together. And interestingly enough, it hasn't been all First Nation on their own. It's been in partnership with people who are truly concerned about, our food sources and work with us. So non-Indigenous people who have lent support to us.
There is a question I have about Indigenous food-based systems being considered a form of radical supply chain decolonization.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think anywhere, like, first of all, the food sovereignty movement came out of a very small group of organizations, well, about 150 of them, under the name of La Via Campesina. And so they were formed on the principles of family violence, woman violence, like violence against women, has to stop. Why? Well, apart from being wrong, it also really interfered with the production of food and food preservation and seed saving because, you know, women were incapacitated sometimes through family violence. So that was their kind of primary principle that they organized around, that plus food sovereignty, but they found that, you know, you couldn't have one without the other. And they talk very much about kind of a guerrilla gardener mentality.
Nice. Love that.
Yeah, where people take ownership. People, the power and control of food stay within the community, primarily amongst women. And the knowledge that sustains this amazing body of knowledge is passed on to future generations. They very much said no to patents on life, like no intellectual property theft around seeds or
So they
food.
didn't get into the Monsanto muck of that ownership thing.
And so it's been a direct response to the commodification of foodstuffs that modern science has been, you know, really responsible for. And I got involved with this way back in the 90s when Indigenous groups in 1992 in Brazil met for the first time to talk about the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that was a document that accrued many benefits to a very small percentage of the world's population, largely around corporate control. And Indigenous people discovered or realized that all of the control going to the Monsantos and the other companies really meant a breakdown of power and control of Indigenous practices and intellectual property rights. So it really became, like they called it, a David and Goliath struggle. And luckily for us, there was farmer movements in India that really analyzed the impact of patenting on life and quickly closed it down. And so, and brought the awareness to us in other parts of the world. And so this was all kind of realized in the events leading up to 1992 at the UN Convention on Sustainability. It was a huge meeting, and I think it was one where Indigenous people were really a critical mass. And they were listening to stories like from a field, like in India, where Indigenous farmers were talking about their loss of, you know, of seeds, etc. So we quickly became educated about the global nature of what was happening in our little fields. And it became a really political moment, one of David and Goliath, where if we're going to sustain any kind of integrity around biodiversity, we need to understand what's going on, and we need to be part of the solution. We need to be involved. So that's kind of like where I became involved back in the 90s, although prior to that, I had also been working in the province up at South End Reindeer and the West Side, trying to discover and encourage people to rebuild their community gardens, because, you know, in all those northern communities, people were growing food. So it's not even a new thing. I learned more than I thought I was teaching at the time. So, yeah.
Do you think if this pandemic continues that Indigenous peoples have the skills to lead a charge away from industrialized food?
Uh, at this point in our province, I think there's small pockets of communities, like, for example, I don't know if you know about Meadow Lake. They have a huge community garden, organic, that has been going on for many years. So we're hoping to, I have a little bit of a project proposal in for Makwasagayan, and we're hoping to work with Meadow Lake. So yes, I think we need to. I think, as I said, I teach this course on Indigenous food sovereignty. It's always filled to capacity because people are really interested in what's up, what's up with food sovereignty. How can we become active? So I think so, but we need to hurry up.
Speaking of hurrying up, I am mindful of time, and I know you're, as I said at the beginning of this, you publish a lot, so you probably got to go and keep writing. But I want to give you the opportunity to have the floor in case you want to talk more generally about anything that we did today, in case you want to give commendations or anything like that to families that you've worked with in the North or organizations. Basically, the floor is yours, Dr. Settee.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, this time in our history is a time to create hope, however we can create hope. I really have concerns about, the direct relationship of the breakdown of the natural world, our relationship with the natural world, and the impacts it's having. And nowhere was that more clearly explained to me than through the voice of the trappers and hunters. So there's such intelligence and insightfulness among people who, are not formally educated, but have such a profound understanding of the world we live in. And even people are saying that, these conditions were predicted by our people 100 years ago or more. And that's kind of profound too, to think that they had the wisdom back then to understand the impact that humanity could have once we became careless and reckless about our world. So we've become careless and reckless.
Knowledge and wisdom, right? Two different things.
Yeah, and it's had a huge impact on us. It's going to have an even huger impact if we don't do something pretty drastic. And I'm thinking, everybody's saying, well, we just need to get back to normal. Well, and many of our people are saying, no, normal wasn't good for us. Normal, what is normal? The continuing pillaging of nature? No, that's not normal. So it is a huge reckoning for us, all of us. Some people have said it's really made us all equal. Well, in some respects, that's true, in that we are all vulnerable to this virus. But at the same time, I think we're seeing that the very impoverished folks in the world have been the ones that suffered the most. And it really makes a call out for examining what we've done wrong and where we need to change. And so it's a new opportunity, and we need to do that very quickly. And, being attached to a large research institution like the University of Saskatchewan, it gives us opportunities to do that. But we need to talk to each other. We need to figure out how our research can reflect the needs of community. And I hope we do that better.
I personally am very happy for you, for the work that you continue to do, as I know many other Northerners are. So thank you for taking the time today, Dr. Settee, Priscilla, to talk about these very important issues. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for, allowing me to speak to you.